Good afternoon, AP Psychology students. Sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I am on my way to Reedsburg for a soccer game. So I thought I'd put together this video so that you guys can stay on track with the other classes so that we're all on pace. Today, we are going to be finishing up our look at neurobiological approaches in the first section of notes. So this will be kind of bringing us to the halfway point of Unit 2. We'll actually be a little bit half past way point. There's a little bit more in this first section than there is going to be in the second section. But basically, what's going to happen here is I'm going to finish up the notes on neurobiological approaches today. Tomorrow, we'll spend some time reviewing to get you ready for a quiz, and then that quiz will happen on Thursday. We're going to jump back into these slides right here, and I will go through some information about genetics and evolution, which now that we're done talking about the brain, neurons, nervous system, all that good stuff, one other section or conversation piece about neurobiological approaches is the difference between how our biology, our genetics, relates to our development as a person, and also the effects of some evolutionary changes and things like that. So whenever we talk about, and some of this stuff will be a little bit of a review because we've already had some conversation about this, but whenever we talk about the role that genetics play versus the role that our environment plays in how we are, the way we turn out, we're talking about the difference between what's called nature versus nurture. So is the way that our brain works and the way that we think about things. You ask yourself questions about who you are as a person, why you have certain personality traits, why certain things come easier to you in certain classes versus other classes. Some people seem better in one place than another. What's going on there? Is that due to your genes and it's just simply by the byproduct of biology, or is that due to your environment? Another way that you can think of that question is what's called behavioral genetics. And this is the study of the role of genes and the environment on our behavior. And sometimes it's very difficult to isolate what is due to genetics and what is due to environmental impacts. One way that we can try to study the difference between genes and environment is by doing things like twin studies, which I'll be getting to in a little bit here. So when we're talking about genetics, we are talking about chromosomes and DNA, which this is something that will not be popping up on your quiz next time on Thursday or on the test. But you guys all should know what chromosomes and DNA and genetics are and genes. But this should just be a recap that your chromosomes are the thread-like structures of your DNA, which is your complex molecules that make up your genetic code. Genes are the units of heredity that contain this code that makes us who we are. And I think, not that you need to know this for this class, but in classes that you've taken for science, you've probably learned about how your DNA is made up of a bunch of different, like A, G, T, and C's, I think are the 4 different letters that you can make up a genetic code with, if I remember correctly. But your genetics are obviously different from every other person's on this planet. And part of what makes you you, part of what makes your psychology is just simply due to your genetics. Now, if we are going to make a estimate on what amount of who you are is due to your genetics, you can use something called the heritability coefficient. So sometimes also known as H squared. Heritability is the measure of which the extent to which variation between any two individuals is due to genetic differences. And depending on what thing we are studying in psychology, you can get different heritability levels with different things. So here's some examples of that. For personality traits, things like extroversion versus introversion, things like being open to new experiences versus not, things like how neat and orderly you are versus how disorganized you are. Depending on which personality trait we're going to talk about, heritability rate is anywhere above 40 to 60%. So some of the traits, I think, like if I remember correctly, introversion versus extroversion tends to be a little bit less genetic versus more genetic versus something like how neat and orderly you are is something that's less genetic. That's much more environmentally determined. We'll study personality, and I'll actually go through with you some of the heritability traits, heritability levels of different personality traits when we study that, but that will be way towards the end of the year, or I think probably like March would be my guess. Intelligence is a little bit more genetically connected. So heritability rates anywhere from 50 to 66%. So at least half, but upwards of almost 2/3 of who you are when it comes to your level of intelligence is thanks to your parents. So thanks, Mom. Assuming you appreciate your intelligence. If you're not happy about your intelligence, then you can go and blame your parents. That's fine. But your parents do set a genetic range for you, and it's decently heritable. Now, how do we know any of this? How do we know these percentages? Well, one way you can do that is by doing twin studies. So, how do we know whether something is due to nature versus nurture? Well, we have these perfect case studies that would be called monozygotic twins. So, AKA identical twins. Monozygotic twins are ones that come from one egg originally. So, it's one egg that splits in half, and they have the exact same genetics. Mono means one, zygote refers to egg. So, it's when one egg that's fertilized splits into two, and you get identical twins. And because they have the exact same genes, right? You got these individuals right here that these two ladies would have the exact same genetics. If you can have a situation where they can be separated twins, which is rare, but it does happen, a psychologist can study these identical twins that are raised in different environments, and they would be considered the perfect case study. So, monozygotic twins that are raised apart in different environments, if there is any difference with them, whether it's their personality differences, intelligence differences, that difference we can say is due to basically 100%. We can know that that's due to environmental impacts. So monozygotic twins are the best to study. Dizygotic can be helpful to study as well, although they do have just similar genes, not identical. They're no different than like brothers and sisters that are not twins, or brothers and brothers, or sisters and sisters that are not twins. Dizygotic twins, di meaning two, zygotic, egg. These would be fraternal twins. So they have similar genes, but they're not identical. But again, if you can get monozygotic twins, identical twins raised in different environments, they can be considered your perfect case study. And if there's any difference between them, we can say that that is due just to environment. And that is how you can then extrapolate and make some inferences about what percent of a person's difference, one person to the next, is due to genetics versus environmental factors. Okay. So here would be identical monozygotic twins, and here are fraternal dizygotic twins. This is a movie that was about some girls in China, I believe, that were separated from birth, but they were identical twins, and they met each other later on. And it is always interesting when you see that there's a lot of similarities, even when identical twins are raised apart. They tend to have a lot of similarities, which again speaks towards the role that genetics does play, and genetics play quite a big role in shaping our psychology. Okay, just the last couple slides here. So, molecular behavioral genetics is a term that refers to this idea that the study of how genes can interact with our environment to shape our behavior, to influence our behavior. So, one of the questions that I threw up here is, are you a good student because your genetics set you up for the choices you are making to be a good student? In other words, is the only reason that you are, a high achieving student is simply because you have the genetics and DNA that sets you up to be a good student? Or is it based on you pushing yourself and working hard and that shapes you into who you are? And the reality is in psychology, when it comes to this question, nature versus nurture question, it's usually always a little bit of both. But what we also know is there's this thing called epigenetics, which is our environment can actually influence our DNA. And we can change who we are as a person by different environmental and genetic influences. So here's just a quick picture of three guys that you may or may not know. But this is LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Kevin Hart. Kevin Hart is a comedian that you might recognize. Dwayne Wade is now a retired basketball player, and LeBron James is still playing at this point. But these guys, very good at basketball. Kevin Hart, not so great at basketball. He really loves basketball and he likes to play it. But given his size, he struggles to, compete at a high level against someone like a LeBron James. Now, did Kevin Hart become a funny guy and comedian because of his height issues? And was LeBron James destined to become a basketball player simply because he had the genetics to set him up? Maybe, maybe not. I don't necessarily have answers to that other than to say that this idea that your genes can kind of set you up for certain successes or challenges that you might face in your life and there's influences of your environment that makes that kind of shaping you into who you are. That's the idea of this gene and environmental kind of co-interaction. All right. Okay. Last slide, evolutionary psychology. So I mentioned evolutionary psychology when we were studying our first unit. That was when we were talking about the different approaches to psychology. As I said in in that first unit, evolutionary psych doesn't get its own unit, but here's kind of like some more information where it does come up here. So evolutionary psych is a study of how evolution's impact on our behaviors and our mind. So it's all about how have our mental processes and our behaviors evolved um, to make us kind of adapt to our environment and allow us to thrive and survive in our environment. So this is working off Darwin's theory of natural selection, excuse me, which is Darwin's principle that we are more likely to keep traits that help us survive, and those traits that do help us survive are the ones that are going to get passed on from one generation to the next to the next. Occasionally, you'll get mutations within our DNA. This can occur during gene replication when replication is happening during baby's development in the womb, and as chromosomes are coming together through the fertilization process, mutations can occur, and out of those mutations, sometimes there's beneficial mutations, sometimes there's not beneficial mutations. But the beneficial mutations tend to be what sticks with us, and then we reproduce those going forward. And so psychologists want to know what aspects of what makes us who we are tend to connect to some sort of evolutionarily um, beneficial traits that we've developed. So I already used this example, but when it comes to like human sexuality, males on average tend to have higher sex drives. Why would this be? So I'm not here with you guys to ask you this question in person, but one of the theories about why males on average across the world tend to have higher sex drive is because there's less of a cost to men to have sex. And again, I don't want to sound sexist in saying this, but women are the one that get pregnant. Men are not. And so there's less of a cost, if you will. And so for them to be sexually active and very highly sexual active, where women tend to be a little bit lower sex drives compared to men, there's more of a cost when it comes to getting pregnant. And so one of the theories is that we've evolved basically to have higher sex drives towards men versus women being a little bit more protective and in their decision making with sex, historically at least, with the evolution theory that comes with that. I already talked about this one too. So this idea of being attracted to more fertile women, um, and women being attracted to more like masculine, kind of strong men. And those are more examples of this evolutionary psychology theory. And this will pop up in several places going forward in other units as well. But this is just a reminder for us in our notes in one other place that evolutionary psychology is another thing that shapes our neurobiological processes. Okay, so that is actually as far as we're going to get today. This Quizlet is linked in the slides if you really want to get a start on starting to review. I'd highly encourage it since there's no other lesson planned for today. What we'll do tomorrow is we'll spend some time either doing some Quizlet live, or we will do some practice questions in AP Classroom, or maybe even both, to help prepare you guys for your test that will be, or sorry, your quiz that will be on Thursday. So if you want to spend some time working with this Quizlet, I'd recommend doing so now. You could partner up with somebody and maybe quiz each other. Otherwise, there is a recommended reading on the board, I believe. Although now I'm thinking about it, we might be at the end of this section, so there might not be a reading yet for later on. Ooh, and then one other thing I did want to talk to you about, and I'll talk briefly about this, and then the sub can come around and pass this out. So I am going to be posting this assignment to AP Classroom, Google Classroom rather, um, and and this will be something that is due for next week Friday. As I have told you before, I like to throw in one summative assignment that is more of a project based thing. So this is going to be Unit 2's summative project that's worth 25 points here. So we're going to do a sleep and dream log, and I thought I would have some time to introduce it now. I do have paper copies of this printed off towards the front of the room, and if the sub wants to pass these out to whoever wants a paper copy of this, you can grab this. But basically what you're going to be doing starting sometime this week or next week, you're going to have to keep track of hopefully 7 days worth of your sleep cycles as well as your dreams with those things. So I've got some tips for you here. We'll talk more in class later this week as well as early next week about why we're doing this. The purpose of this exercise is basically to help you look at and examine your sleeping and dream patterns, and then also do some work on researching some stuff about sleep disorders. So there's a couple questions to go with it. But basically what you're going to be doing here is you're just keeping track of how many hours per night are you getting in terms of sleep. How would you rate that quality of sleep? Can you estimate how many dream or dream fragments you had? I know that some people really struggle to be able to remember their dreams. And if that's the case, no worries. This is more so just kind of for the fun of the activity. Um, if you can't remember dreams whatsoever the whole time through, you're not going to get a worse grade because of it. There's a couple questions here about rating the emotional tone, the activity level, the setting, the focus, and I'll give you some numbers that go with that. I'll talk in more details about this when I'm back with you again tomorrow. And then there's kind of some summary questions when you're done with this process. So you don't need to start this tonight by any means. If you want to start it tonight, you can. You're supposed to try to do 7 days worth. This isn't going to be due till the end of next week. So you've got at least like 10, 11, 12 days. So if you choose not to start this until next week, you'll be fine with that or over this weekend. But trying to have 7 nights worth of data here to figure out what your averages are in terms of how much sleep you're getting and what kind of dream life you have. And then there's going to be this final section where you're going to be typing up some information about sleep disorders. We'll learn more about these next week, early next week. I think probably next week, Tuesday would be my guess, Monday or Tuesday. So not something you need to start right now, but if you want to, you could use last night's information of sleep if you remember the information about what you slept last night and what your dreams were about last night. You don't need to write details, by the way, of your dreams. That's optional because I get that dreams are sometimes private and personal. But if you do have some comments about it, you can write down something that goes with it. So I'll remind you about this and go through it with you later, but I wanted to get this out there now just in case you wanted to start recording data sooner than later. So if you want to grab a paper copy of this, do. Otherwise, I just wanted to make you aware of this now that this is posted. So shoot me an email if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you guys tomorrow, and we'll do some review to get you ready for your quiz on the brain neurobiological approaches. That will be on Thursday. Thanks, guys.